it begins. Don't cry.
I'm going to start by mentioning the positives the Dark Souls franchise has to offer. So first of all, it's the music. I must admit, these games have to offer some great epic soundtracks, especially during the boss fights. Sadly though, the combat is the opposite of epic. One problem I have with their music is sometimes there is too much in-game noise happening that ruins the music, like things on the background crashing, barrels getting destroyed, or just obnoxiously loud boss attacks. Other than that, it's great. Another thing this franchise does well is the level design. The way the levels and the pathways are connected are very interesting because they incentivize you to explore, make you wonder what's next and see the beauty of it. Figuring out all the possible ways you can go and how to obtain some unreachable items can be quite puzzling and fun. In fact, those are the only times I had the tiniest amount of fun in these games. It's also interesting how they manage to reuse the levels as assets, making you go back and forth and backtrack to do some extra quests. That being said, the level design is not perfect, far from it. While the design itself is pretty good, the coloring is pretty horrible, the visuals are exhausting to the eye, and the enemies, along with the loot, sometimes blend in with the background or the environment. The lack of a map also means you might get confused sometimes and might come back to areas you have been before for no good reason, making you waste a lot of time when they could simply implement a map. There are times when the level design doesn't make much sense, meaning you think you can go somewhere that appears like a secret place, but you end up getting out of the game's boundaries, resulting to your death. The amount of ladders and elevators are also a disgusting waste of time. I understand those are supposed to be an immersive loading screen, but there is such a thing as a way too long of a loading screen. I would gladly sacrifice my immersion for a shorter loading screen in this case. There are also so many secret areas that are impossible to find on your own without any online help, unless you are the kind of idiot who wastes time hitting every single wall you see. There are many levels with very janky traps and obstacles, along with the camera, making some platforming and navigating sections a nightmare. Speaking of camera, the camera itself is one of the worst cameras I've seen in a video game, and apparently they never intend to fix it because it has been consistently terrible throughout the entire franchise. But the biggest problem with the level design is still the enemies that constantly waste your time and annoy you, not allowing you to enjoy and explore. The enemies themselves are the biggest interruptions, and we will get to the combat really soon. Also, from what I've heard, these games have a really good lore. They don't have any story, just lore, and the lore of these games is explained by tiny pieces of information that you read in all kinds of items you find throughout the entirety of the games. I'm personally not interested in the lore of a game where the combat is absolute garbage, but from what I've heard, if the people who analyze the lore are accurate and are not pretentious making up shit, then the lore is definitely good. I don't care enough to read all the items to fact check them, so I'll just have to trust them on this one, even though this fandom is one of the least trustworthy fandoms I have seen in my life. Let's start with the best part of the combat, according to the fandom of course, which is the boss fights. The boss fights are supposed to be very hard, making epic fights, and beating them is supposed to make you feel really good for yourself, as if you accomplished something. I'm going to start by mentioning the boss fights of Dark Souls 1, the beloved classic game that's considered the masterpiece even until now. So Dark Souls 1 has many gimmicky boss fights. In video games, there are two kinds of gimmicky boss fights. One is when the boss fight has a gimmick that is an extension of the game's core combat, where you use all the mechanics you have learned so far to work around that gimmick strategically in your own way, allowing you to use many options to deal with that gimmick. For example, in Final Fantasy VII Remake, the Crab Warden boss fight has such a gimmick. The boss has 4 breakable legs, and breaking one of its legs puts it into a pressure mode, making it easy for you to break its defenses. So during the fight, you get to choose on how you want to deal with its legs. Either focus attacking them one by one, or use area of effect attacks, dealing damage to many of them at the same time, or use strong magic attacks to quickly destroy them, or use basic attacks to lower their health slowly and saving up your mana for the strong magic attacks once its defenses are broken. The game itself has a lot of depth in its core combat, and those gimmicks are just adding more to it, becoming an extension of it. Now let's talk about the other kind of gimmick, which is the cryptic one. This one is not something you play around with, it's something you need to figure out through trial and error. But once you figure it out, the fight becomes easy in every single playthrough unless you forget it. And if you are incapable of figuring it out, the fight will be seemingly impossible. So sadly, the Dark Souls games have the cryptic kind of gimmick, which is all about figuring out and getting easy wins instead of using your techs to play around. And the fandom's favorite boss fight is Artorias the Abyss Walker. But in reality, this is actually one of the worst boss fights the first game has to offer. So here's how the boss fight works. All you need to do is use the dodge roll button when the boss attacks. It doesn't even matter which direction you are dodge rolling to, because the dodge roll gives you invincibility frames, which means even if a nuke was falling on you, if you dodge roll at the moment of the impact, you will avoid the nuke. It's a one button defense that allows you to avoid almost every attack the game can throw at you. So once you have learned how to avoid the boss's attacks, all you need to do is to use your own basic attacks to hit and damage the boss, and you need to make sure you are using few and fast attacks to make sure that the boss won't be attacking the same time you are, because that will get you destroyed. So that's all you do here. You roll, you poke, you roll, you poke. Now that sounds kind of boring and simple, but the main problem of this is that's exactly how you fight every single non-gimmicky boss fight and every single enemy in the entire genre. That's what a Souls-like is. That's the core combat of the Souls-like games. Because apparently the fandom liked this boss fight so much, not only was the franchise filled with them, but an entire genre was born where all the enemies and bosses play exactly like that. Now I know many of you have a question and you want to know why. What the hell is wrong with the fandom? The short answer to that is, the fandom is filled with extremely low IQ morons who are permanently stuck in their basements, never having achieved anything until they played these games. And like the stupid losers they are, they weren't able to see what these games are about, and their brains got tricked into thinking they have finally accomplished something. They now think they are capable of doing something great, like beating a hard game, when in reality these games are not hard, and I will explain why now. Crash Bandicoot is a platforming game with basic moves such as sliding and spinning that allow you to hit enemies. Take a look at this boss fight. It uses its trident to jump towards you until it gets tired, and then you hit him, taking 1/3 of its health, proceeding to the next phase, where it's unleashing some arena lions to run towards the screen, and you avoid them with some platforming and positioning. Then it starts jumping towards you again until it gets tired, you hit him again and you proceed to the third phase, which is very similar to the second phase. Now here is how you could make this an objectively harder boss fight. If this boss was creating a couple of shockwaves which would require you to do some precision jumping to avoid, while simultaneously sending the lions during its jumps, it would become immediately an objectively harder boss, but without wasting any more of your time. It would just require more skill to dodge all the shockwaves and the lions, and that's that. Now how about we make it hard in a different way? What if we remove the lions completely and just make him do the jump attack, but instead of requiring 3 hits to go down, we increase the hits to 100? Would that make the fight hard? The answer is still yes. Despite being an easy boss fight, the fact that it would require so many hits means you are more likely to lose your focus in such a long time. But here's the thing, the reason a smart person would lose their focus is mainly because of boredom. If a smart person would see a boss fight making him do the exact same thing for such a long time, they would think that the developers are stupid and the game is not worth their time, and they would quit it right then and there and do something better with their time. A normal person would still beat the boss, but afterwards would realize it wasn't worth it, it was just a waste of time, and would move on to do something better with their time, having regrets. What a stupid person would do is beat the boss fight and think of it as an accomplishment. The stupid person would think that the smart person only quit because he couldn't do it, and the normal person is only complaining because it was still too hard for him. Then that stupid person would proceed to increase his ego, let it get to their head, and brag about it for the rest of their life. The Dark Souls games require no skill because they are trial and error games. What do I mean by that? The Immortal is an old video game that has a trial and error gameplay. The game is constantly killing you with all kinds of traps, and there is nothing you can do except for memorize their positions so you can know how to avoid them on your next try.
Challenge is one thing, but in this game, every step can be deadly. Arrows, flames, giant worms, and there's bats that blend with the dark backgrounds. I mean, how can you avoid something which you cannot see? Trapdoors are everywhere, which is a cheap shot, no question about it. I mean, can I walk here or will the floor swallow me? I mean, you'll never know. There's no strategy, no reward for skill. Thou must play it repeatedly to memorize where the pits are. These invisible pits are nothing but a cheap, mean-spirited beginner's trap meant to elicit false and ill-earned replay value. And also, if you touch anything, you die. Step on the wrong floor tile, you die. You search the same spot more than once, you die. You approach a ladder or try to climb down a hole from the wrong side, you die. You stand still for too long, you die. You see some tiny little pixel that might be something you can pick up? Nay, chances are it is but death. In other words, bullshit of the lowest standard. And as mentioned, even thine inventory kills you. When you can't even trust the items, what can you do? Your character is vulnerable to everything, and for a game called The Immortal, it begs the question, who is the Immortal? Because it's certainly not the main character. At one point, in the very first level, you get an amulet, which has an incantation on it. You're given the chance to read it, but if you pick yes, you die. However, the amulet is required to beat the level, so don't read that. But I repeat, the item that is required to beat the level can also kill you. How could you make a game in the year of 1990 following a wealth of other games and ignore all that was done previously right? What art thou thinking? This was made by Electronic Arts? More like electronic farts!
Dragon's Lair is another fine example. It's a game where cutscenes are playing out, and during the cutscene you need to make a very quick decision by pressing one of the directional buttons or the action button. If you fail, you die and you have to try again. It's almost impossible to tell which one is the right button to press because of so many nonsensical animations happening all at the same time. So all you have to do is keep dying and retrying again, making it a pure trial and error game. And generally speaking, many of the old games were mostly trial and error, not just because of the limitations of that time, but also because back in that time there were a lot of arcade shops that had machines which required coins to play these games, and every time you died you had to put an extra coin to retry and get another chance to make progress and see what's next. It was a way of making money out of bored people who have nothing better to do with their time. Having a little bit of trial and error in your game is not necessarily a bad thing. For example, Celeste is a 2D platformer which is extremely hard if you are going for 100% completion. It has some stages that require godlike reflexes and they are pretty much impossible to be beaten in the first try. But after trying once and failing, since you know what you have to do, the second attempt is 100% a matter of skill. these games have delayed inputs, which means the button I'm pressing will register slightly later. The controls are not really responsive. So if an attack is coming at me, I need to press the dodge button slightly before the attack is going to connect, so my character can manage to dodge a time. But if an attack is too fast, I might be quick enough to press the button, but the character still won't dodge due to the delayed register, which means I need to predict when an attack is coming by watching the enemy animations. And since the animations don't make a lot of sense about what kind of attack is going to come, where and how, I need to get hit first so I can see, and getting hit means taking damage, and taking a lot of damage means death. And besides that, there are a lot of delayed attacks the enemies do, and when you see a delayed attack, since you don't know when it's coming, you can only take a wild guess, which will most likely lead to a failure. If you try to dodge too early, you might get hit between your dodge intervals, which means you just have to memorize the exact seconds the enemies take to attack, and that might take a couple of times. And of course the camera is always there to make everything way worse. So yeah, these games are made to kill you constantly. You die because you got hit by a couple of attacks, you think you figured out the animation, on your next try you still die because the animation doesn't really make much sense, it's not visually accurate, the collision detection is all over the place, and the camera keeps freaking out. So you keep trying again and again and again. And that's not even all. If the enemy AI was smart, it would be completely impossible for the player to win. All the enemy AI would have to do is attack the moment it sees the player attacking. In a constant exchange of blows, the stronger one would always win. So the most effective way to reduce your chances of losing to zero is making sure the enemy attacks first and keep dodging all of the attacks until the enemy's combo attack ends, and then just poke a little bit before the enemy starts attacking again. But guess what? No one plays these games like that. Most people just attack the first chance they get, and they keep attacking, hoping the enemy won't use any of its quick attacks, or hoping the enemy will somehow miss. When you fight two or more enemies at the same time, there is no consistent way of winning. When your dodge roll animation begins, that's when your character gains the invincibility frames, and before using the next dodge roll, there is a tiny window where you are vulnerable to attacks, before making the next dodge roll and becoming invincible again. Which means, when fighting two enemies, once the first one attacks and you dodge roll to avoid it, if the second enemy attacks between the dodge roll intervals, the time that you are vulnerable, you will get hit, and there is nothing you can do to prevent that. Which means, if you don't want to get hit, you need to always isolate the enemies and take them out one by one. The worst player can take out multiple enemies by mindlessly attacking, and the best player can die fighting two enemies by getting unlucky with the enemy AI. It has nothing to do with skill, it's pure luck. So most people win by heavily relying on luck, and they will still pretend they are winning because of skill, because they are so desperate to stroke their ego. One of the very first mechanics you realize when you play these games is that your attacks get stopped when you hit a wall, and you would think that kind of mechanic would incentivize strategic play and make you position yourself properly in narrow corridors so you can deal with enemies that have huge weapons, making their attacks stop when hitting the walls and limiting their movements. But no, the wall stopping weapon attacks is a rule only applied to the player. Not only does that rule not apply to the enemies can see you and attack you through almost every single wall and ceiling that exists in the entire franchise.
I'd like to see you get. Never fucking mind! What trolley shit? What trolley shit was that? How did that big mofo fit through that door? Honestly, I can't even believe that.
These games are so incredibly unpolished, it's not even funny, and you don't know what kind of enemies to expect when you are exploring, so you have no clue if your own weapon is going to be useful or it's going to work against you. And the game is also punishing you for equipping multiple weapons by making you heavier and slower to move around. Once again, this is another example of pure trial and error. The stamina system is also garbage, it's only meant to waste your time. After dodge rolling to avoid a couple of attacks and attacking, every now and then you have to run away from the fight and wait until your stamina gets restored so you can get back to the fight and do a couple of dodge rolls and attacks again. The controls are floaty and junky, and when you get hit in places that you can easily fall, there is a good chance you will die in that one hit. The game doesn't even have mechanics that would allow you to balance yourself to prevent that kind of garbage happening. Let me show you what an actual skill-based game looks like. Good action games with real depth, such as Ninja Gaiden 2 and Devil May Cry 5, have an entire moveset for every single weapon of every single character, and you can use any of those moves as a follow-up to any other attack that you used beforehand, while simultaneously switching through your weapons, and you can even interrupt those moves midway and replace them with another attack or one of the many movement options. By memorizing all these moves one by one and understanding their hitboxes and movement range, you slowly and steadily master your character until you reach a point where you have so much freedom because of all the options you can use to deal with anything the game throws at you. All those crazy players who can do all those insane combos in these games are skilled, which means even if these games dropped a DLC today that introduces a lot of new enemies and bosses, they would still be able to deal with them. These games are responsive, which means you can dodge enemies by simply observing the enemy attacks that are coming at you. In games like Dark Souls, the skill ceiling is always at 0. You master your character right at the tutorial, and the only thing you need to do is memorize enemy attack pattern animations so you can time them with your dodge roll button. There is no skill involved whatsoever. It's a simple memory game. It requires no reflexes or brains. That being said, the main difference between these action games and Dark Souls is Dark Souls are not just action games, they are action RPGs, and what I have been describing until now is mainly the core action gameplay. So since the RPG aspect is pretty heavy on these games, that must mean that's probably what makes these games great, right? All the different kinds of builds and spells and weapons, those are probably the things that add depth to the Dark Souls games, right? Well, guess what? The RPG mechanics of these games somehow manage to make them even worse. The Dark Souls games allow you to choose one of the many classes when you are starting the game, and they like to pretend that there are so many different builds and playstyles you can choose from, but in reality there are only two playstyles. One is the melee playstyle, the one that I've been describing until now, where you stick close to the enemy, risking to get hit and learning their attack patterns, and the other playstyle is the ranged one, where you stay far away and you damage the enemies without any risks. The enemy AI is completely stupid and wasn't created to be able to do anything against range attacks, so you can beat the entire game with a range playstyle without trying in the slightest. So even though the game had an artificial difficulty that just makes the game tedious and long just to take up a lot of your time and give you the illusion of hardship, the games are giving you an extremely easy way to remove even that. Now, of course, the fandom knows that, even though they still can't stop pretending that the game is hard. What they don't know is that ranged attacks are not just magic. They can be bows, items, and even long weapons such as spears. All of those options are allowing you to skip the core combat of the gameplay, which is the one that revolves around the learning the patterns and timing them with the dodge roll button. Even equipping very strong weapons on two hands and one-shotting enemies is still considered just as much cheese as using magic, because you are still skipping the core combat loop. So all these players who think they are so good at the game because they know which melee weapons are good and using them to one-shot many enemies at once are still technically playing a mage with extra steps. These games are extremely imbalanced, and you can technically transform any of the starting classes to anything you want by leveling up the right stats. So despite these games being completely broken, people will still pretend this is some kind of perfectly crafted masterpiece. Speaking of the leveling system, these games have some of the worst leveling systems I have ever seen. So to level up, you need to use a currency named souls, which is the exact same currency used for literally everything: buying weapons, items, upgrades, spells, everything uses the soul's currency. So when you are trying to level up, you choose one of the attributes, and the first timer does not really know which one of these attributes is the best for their class or how many times they need to level up each. And it's not like you can hold up on your levels and wait until later on, because the game has a stupid system where if you die once, you lose all of your souls and you revive back at your checkpoint, having one chance to go exactly to the place you died and recover your souls. If you die a second time before recovering your souls, then your souls are lost forever. So to lower the risks, people will just throw those levels to any attribute they think might be useful. But that's also punishing, because gaining levels becomes extremely hard later on. So if you find some kind of gear that you would have really wanted to try on, it becomes impossible because all the gear and the builds have certain status requirements. And once you start trying to level up the attributes for the gear that you have found and want to equip, it's going to take so much time until you finally equip the gear, it will have become useless and you will have found already better gear. And generally speaking, since the game doesn't give you any hints or descriptions on what all these status effects and buffs do, it's pretty much impossible to know how good a piece of equipment is until you waste all that time to level up and try it out. And if it happens to not be that good, then you are pretty much completely screwed, or stick to a combat that becomes more and more tedious since you are weaker and the enemies are getting stronger. So it's not just the combat that is trial and error, the entire game is. Everything you want to check out is going to cost so much of your time, and there are so many absolute garbage spells and weapons that makes you wonder what the hell were the developers thinking, putting all that useless crap in the game. There is an assassin class with spells that are meant to make assassinations easier. Meanwhile, these spells are completely useless and there isn't even an indicator for backstabs, which is basically the assassination mechanic. These games are so junky that even if you stand exactly behind an enemy, a backstab might fail, and there are times when you are fighting them right in front of them and somehow you manage to pull a backstab out of nowhere. Also, the magic system is an abomination, where you have to roll through your spells one by one until you find the one you want, kind of like the very old games, but those get an excuse because of that time's limitations. Games like Kingdom Hearts 1 and even PS1 games had figured out a system where you can hold one button that will open up a mini window which has shortcuts to all the spells you've put, but apparently the From Software devs still haven't figured it out yet. And in all honesty, it's not like it matters, since you can completely break the game easily by constantly spamming one strong spell. I have played over 4,000 games in my entire life, and this franchise easily goes on the top 50 most boring ones. Not just because the combat is terrible and slow and bad and repetitive, but also because I can hardly remember playing a game that tries so aggressively to waste your time. The death animations can last a couple of seconds when they should be instantaneous, and there is also a decently huge loading screen after your death. And if you thought that's bad, the checkpoint placement of these games is absolute cancer. Instead of putting the checkpoints right before the boss fights, they are put far away, which means every time you die, you have to walk all that way back to the boss, while you also have the enemies constantly interrupting you. Also, these games are constantly auto-saving, which means if you want to try out a rare item to see what it does and how it works, you will just end up wasting it, and then you need to spend even more time to either buy it or kill enemies who have a chance of dropping it, and hoping the next time you try it out you will figure out more about how it works. You can't pause these games even in offline single player mode, which means sometimes when you are fighting a boss and you are close to winning, you might need to do something important, you will lose the boss fight and waste time doing it again. The boredom and lack of brain stimulation these games have caused me was insufferable. I was feeling like I was imprisoned in solitary confinement. Every now and then I had the urge to do literally anything else. Working out, reading information, studying, literally doing anything else was more interesting than playing these pieces of trash.